Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new soundtrack from Oneohtrix Point Never for the movie Good Time. Oneohtrix Point Never is the alias for Daniel Lopatin, an experimental/ambient producer who's been around for about a decade. Not that long, admittedly, but the guy has completely cemented his place in history at this point, having introduced to the world his super unique stylings and shown off some amazingly creative and crazy experimentations that still remain fairly accessible and easily enjoyable listens. Ton of respect for the guy, to be sure. Now, the guy's had a pretty interesting output to date, so how about I go down the guy's discography so far. Just as stuff as Oneohtrix Point Never, by the way. It's a pretty minimalistic and especially spooky ambient release with some synth melody focused stuff here and there, and some pure, formless, atonal ambience. Pretty cool overall, I'd say. More focused on synth melodies, but pretty similar to the previous album overall. Good in its own right, though. This one is themed after the journey of a Russian cosmonaut, apparently. I think that space theme does come across pretty well in his usual ambient sound. Probably the best in the original trilogy of albums. Okay, so this is a compilation of tracks from various obscure tapes of his, some of which I have in fact heard, such as Transmat Memories, Pact Between Strangers, and Young Bade Naga, which I'll admit were not the best, but this compilation covers the big highlights from those, and adds a couple I hadn't heard yet until getting ready for this video. So, yeah, pretty cool. Another collection of various rare tracks from random obscure tapes and releases, none of which I had heard previously, though still stylistically similar to the stuff that came before it, and as a side note, the previous 4 releases I've discussed and this make an appearance on his Rifts compilation, all conveniently together in the same package. This is the point at which the guy's career really started to pick up traction and he started to get more of a fan base. It's not that far a cry from his earlier stuff, still making minimalistic ambient stuff, although now it's a bit more detailed and textured. Also, the album opens up with, so far, the only harsh noise piece I've ever derived personal enjoyment from. I may not love the sound, but at least there's a lot of texture and attention to detail in that track that I can, latch onto, so, nice stuff overall. On this album, we see Lopatin switching over to a more sample-based style, though presenting it in a particularly unique and creative fashion, looping and layering clips in weird ways and creating a beautiful experience. I think it also contributed to the beginnings of Vaporwave, or at the very least, it kinda invalidates listening to the more obvious Vaporwave predecessor, Chuck Person's Echo Jams, which was also by Lopatin. But yeah, this is similar but better in every way. And this one, as some may recall, it made my favorites of all time list, taking his synth-based style into weird and abstract places that don't compromise the listenability in any way. Just fantastic album. Basically the dark, abrasive, and loud cousin to R+7. I haven't returned to it nearly as much as that one, though it did make my best albums of 2015 list, and I still think it deserves its spot there. Which brings us to here. Now, of course, this album is interesting, obviously being a film soundtrack. Because of this fact, I also went out of my way to see the movie, which is still in theaters as of recording this, and was not available digitally yet. In fact, it's not that super widely available in theaters either. Even though there's a theater within walking distance of my house, sort of, it wasn't showing there. Like, the closest theater that was showing this movie was a 40-minute drive away. So that was a little bit of a pain, but whatever, I still saw it so that I could discuss the soundtrack in more detail. So, before I start talking about the movie, I'll talk about the soundtrack from a pure, out-of-context listening experience. And, it's pretty dang good. I don't know about great, purely by way of being a film soundtrack. It doesn't have the freedom for the same attention to detail and craziness of his last couple of mainline albums, but it does still work really well, just purely as a Oneohtrix Point Never album. The soundtrack shows Lopatin kind of going back to doing something more along the lines of his early tapes, like the Rifts days. A lot of the same kind of cascading square wave-y synth melodies that would characterize older albums of his, like Zones Without People, but not quite so minimalistic. It's clearly the Oneohtrix Point Never that has learned a lot from previous releases of his, like Replica and R+7 and Garden of Delete. I mean, you do have plenty of psychedelic effects in there as well, and other random details and sounds that make the whole thing more interesting and engaging a listen. Like, you got some guitar-like synths in there occasionally, as well as what sounds like, real guitar distortion. Some creepy voices, acid house squirting, synth strings and choirs, dark atonal synth ambience, which reminds me a little bit of the Submachine soundtracks. R+7 style organs, and all sorts of tones and timbres in there. Oh yeah, and also voice clips from the movie. To be honest, I wish the voice clips weren't there. I think it kind of takes out of the immersion of listening to the soundtrack album, and if I wanted dialogue, I'd watch the movie. But, oh well. Not much to say from an individual track perspective. They all work well individually and have cool melodies and or a really nice dark atmosphere. But I do have to discuss one track that sticks out like a sore thumb, both just looking at the track listing, but also listening to the album. And that's the final track, The Pure and the Damned, which is like a kind of slow piano ballad featuring the vocals of Iggy Pop, of all people, with a little bit of Lopatin synths coming in at some choice moments. And while it's a good track, Iggy Pop's vocals sounding particularly suitably world-weary and overall sounding quite emotional and fitting the ending of the movie where it's placed. As I said, it feels a little out of place when listening to it out of context. Nothing on the rest of the soundtrack comes anything close to sounding like it. It's a little jarring, mainly because of Iggy Pop, but whatever. And in the movie, like I said, while it works for the story and is fitting, they also laid it over the credits scene, which has people trying to talk over Iggy Pop, and it doesn't 100% work there either. Though you can't actually blame that on Lopatin. And on that note, let's discuss the soundtrack in the context of the movie. Basically, that last fact is really the only gripe I had with this soundtrack in context. The movie Good Time was a really enjoyable watch, and I think Lopatin was one of the biggest factors in that. So, this movie is like a thriller movie, a bank heist thriller. Two brothers, one of whom, Nick, is mentally handicapped, and the other one, Connie, who is obviously the main character, pushes him into helping him out with robbing a bank, and most of the movie is spent watching Connie desperately try to get away with it. And the movie is also particularly stylized. It's interestingly colorful and vibrant. Like, there's a pretty long sequence that takes place inside a carnival with, like, black lights and stuff. And nearly every shot is done in, like, subtle shaky cam. And I don't mean like this shaky cam where you can't see anything that's going on there. I mean it's, like, really subtle. Like, just everything's it unnerves you. It helps add to the suspense. And just looking at the movie's premise and other people's descriptions, it actually drew more than a few comparisons to 2012 Pusher movie, that one that Orbital scored shortly before breaking up. Let me actually explore this comparison further, because I was thinking about Pusher after reading about other people's descriptions of this movie being the story of some guy who lives a life of crime, watches his life go slowly down the toilet, shot in particularly flashy and stylized fashion with electronica legends doing the soundtrack. Here's the thing, though. This movie was way better than Pusher. And so was the soundtrack. Good Time got basically everything right that Pusher got wrong. I think I have been slowly coming to terms with the idea that Orbital might have single-handedly ruined that movie for me with their soundtrack, matching the energy of the scenes fairly well, but providing little to no emotional weight, and as a result leading me to be much less invested and feeling like Orbital were just kind of there to fill a void, and even made it difficult to really care about what was going on. It really does pain me to say things like that about my favorite band, but Now with Good Time, I suppose the fact that I saw it in the theater probably made a big difference, and maybe that would have changed Pusher as well, but there's really no way for me to find that out. But with Good Time, I was almost constantly invested, like, the whole time. Well, okay, there were some parts where it kind of shifted which character was the focus. Like, there was one long section where, like, a side character explains his entire backstory in a flashback, and that section did kind of take me out just because of, it's a side character talking about his backstory. But even during that kind of unnecessary segment, Like, we had the track Flashback from the soundtrack playing underneath, and it still kept me invested in what was going on. I think it really was Oneohtrix Point Never's soundtrack that really brought it all home. To use an actual good scene as an example, probably my favorite scene in that movie was the hospital escape. This part genuinely had me totally on the edge of my seat, and like, the suspense in that part was awesome, and Lopatin's music made that section all the more suspenseful and effective. Now, as for whether I recommend this soundtrack, I would say yes, obviously. Though I do have to put in the caveat that it is better in the context of the movie than it is as an album experience. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still really good, just straight listening to it without visuals, and it's worth checking out for any Lopatin fans out there, just not quite as special without the movie. I don't think I'd call this one of the greatest soundtracks I've ever heard, but it is basically everything I ever could have wanted out of a film soundtrack by Oneohtrix Point Never. Both the movie and the soundtrack live up to their title, and they're definitely worth checking out. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it, so that's all for today, see you next time.